A lot of people are maybe doing customer research the wrong way or approaching it a little bit wrong. B2B decisions, especially purchasing decisions, they are not done on impulse. There is emotion, but a lot of it is driven by the mechanics of their buyer's business model. Buyers who probably are aware that you exist, or may not be, they at least are aware that the problems exist, but for some reason they have not prioritized solving it. What is the toolkit that you give them to actually now take this knowledge and do something with it? All I do is I sign action. Hello, welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin Tysick. On today's episode, I'm joined by Ryan Paul Gibson, who is the founder at Content Lift, and we're talking about all things customer research. Welcome to the show, Ryan. Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate you letting me go on about this. Yeah, I work at a company that does Testimonial, so customer interviews and customer research, something kind of near and dear to my heart now, so I think this will be a fun one. But let's dive right in, and I think a lot of marketers are I think a lot of people are maybe doing customer research the wrong way or approaching it a little bit wrong. Curious your thoughts there. Like, what are some common mistakes that you're seeing there that make it all go awry? I see a few buckets. One is they're doing it and they're fine. The second is the one you mentioned. And the third is they don't do it at all. And in B2B, that is sort of more prevalent than you see in consumer markets. We could talk about that if you want. And I think there's a whole bunch of rationales as to why or excuses as to why. But your question, mistakes, I think one of the challenges we look at when we're doing research in a B2B context, I think what we often forget is the depth of information that we need to understand how to build marketing and sales programs. Because marketing, B2B decisions, especially purchasing decisions, they are not done on impulse. They're not things that there is emotion, but a lot of it is driven by the mechanics of their buyer's business model, their goals, all these things. And those are the lenses through which they see a solution and then like the value of a solution. So I think one of the challenges is, one, we don't get enough depth of research. Two, we don't segment and define who we want to talk to get the insights we need. And third is we treat research as this blanket thing. There's so much to understand about a buyer's business and how we interact with them, because sometimes the relationships with a customer are over years. So we have to understand how we interact with them at various stages of our relationship. And you can't get most of that in one conversation, or one survey. So I think those are usually the three things that I see where people fall down with the research. One of the jokes we have in LinkedIn, when I talk to the researchers, is that it's often seen as it's a dirty word inside a business. And again, for lots of reasons, but I think those are the things I see Dustin the most. Yeah, and I think, the fact that it's a dirty word, like you said, in some businesses, and that it's an ongoing thing, I find a lot of people rely more on things like call recordings or AI to transcribe it, which I do think helps. I don't think that's full-on research. I think we do that, but how do you get the depth then? Is it just the full-on conversations? Well, it's a whole range of things. So just on that point, absolutely, sales calls are fine. People have been recording sales calls now for the last 15, 20 years, so even longer than that. Like, that's nothing new. I think the technology has made it easier, but I think you need to step back and understand, like, what is a sales call? Well, it's at the stage that the buyer has high intent to purchase, and they've pretty much done a lot of the evaluation already. When they get to a sales motion or a high intent motion, they often don't understand terms and conditions, integrations, cost structures, just like even onboarding costs. What's the timeline for things? Who's gonna all the nuances of how it's actually gonna fit within the business. Before they get to that, though, there's all these things happening inside their business that they to prioritize that they're gonna probably improve something or solve a problem, and then eventually over months or years build a short list and get to that high intent stage. What are they doing then? That stuff does not show up in a sales call. If it does, it's like sort of glossed over. It's not going to show up in surveys. It's not going to be on your dashboards. So to your question, how do you go get it? Calls and understanding, like, out in the ethers, how people are talking about different problems and issues. There's different ways we frame them historically. Some people call them like buying triggers. Some people will call them like category entry points if we're using sort of like the Byron Sharp methodology. But at the end of the day, there's all these key drivers that are triggered within a business, and then they start looking to the ethers for how they're going to solve this problem. And then that's what marketing needs to understand, is that specific point. Because if I can influence that point way before it gets to sales, then I have a better chance of actually influencing their decision. That's a long answer. Nobody just asked, but that's like the key thing. Sales calls are good. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
For sure. Yeah. I think in general, research is one of those things where it gets to the point where people will do the research and then not know how to categorize, summarize, and act on it, just because, like you said, it's an ongoing thing with many different stages. And I find that's where they get lost. They send out the survey, they have the conversations, and then nothing comes of it.
Yeah. I mean, and again, there's reasons for that as well. I can talk about some of the methods that I take on in my work, but a lot of it comes down to, if you don't understand what you're doing the research for and why, and then you don't understand how you're going to action this stuff and what you're going to define success to look like after you've vetted all the data and then measured your implementation of the insights from the data and see whether you've moved the needle. Like, just going out and talking to people isn't going to do much if you don't have all those other things mapped out as well.
Yeah, it's when you describe it, it sounds, scientific method, basically, right? Like, have a hypothesis, do the research, and then, see the findings.
It sort of is. I try not to keep it too academic for companies that I work with. And I teach customer discovery at an incubator here where I am in Ottawa, Canada. I do working sessions with a lot of product marketers, founders, leaders of marketing teams around how to sort of approach this. And I try to take a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that removes a lot of like the headiness of it. And saying, okay, if we want to break it down to brass tacks, what are the steps that you need to take to sort of get from here to here? Because we're not going back to like statistics, 401, and we're not trying to be like economic majors. It's not the point.
Yeah.
The point is to gather insights that are actually usable for you to make informed decisions in the business, and that you don't need a PhD to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the one thing I've tried to think through it is like buyer and customer research is slightly different. Like when you're talking to prospects or your total addressable market or your ICP or whatever versus your customers who have used the product. So do you completely separate those two and take different approaches, focus on one over the other?
I don't change the methodology. I change what I want to understand. So for some people who may not be aware of the statistic, the majority of a market is not in a high intent buying motion at most points in their life cycle. A really good example is how many times you buy a CRM. Once you buy HubSpot, it might be 3 or 5 years before you move to something else, if at all. It's different now. That's not a monolith. There's all sorts of different cycles and rationales for buying products. If I have a calendar schedule, I might be switching that in and out every couple of months based on price, what have you. If I'm building like a manufacturing plant, probably only doing that every 20 years, right? So there's in nuances to all these things. But your question around, buyer versus customer. So customers have a different sort of mindset when they are looking at the approaches they're going to take in market versus buyers who probably are aware that you exist or may not be. They at least are aware that the problems exist, but for some reason they have not prioritized solving it. Well, why? I've been in B2B 21 years, and early stage companies often get hung up on that. If I show them the thing, they're going to buy it. And that's not true over all the data we've seen over decades of B2B transactions. What really happens is buyers understand that they have an assortment of problems, but they prioritize which ones they're going to solve quarter to quarter, year after year, because of all these various conditions that exist within their business model. Well, what are those things? And then what causes them to prioritize investing in the solution? But that's what I want to focus on when I'm doing buyer research. How do they see a category? What do they see as their options in a market and the various approaches? Because maybe they're actually comparing your solution against, if you have a piece of software, maybe they're comparing you against an actual service-based business. And they're thinking that maybe either one of these could work for us for different reasons. So we need to understand, okay, well, what do they see as their options in the market? How do they view these things in the context of their business model? And so on and so forth. So I won't answer the question, but like when I talk to a customer, it's more about, well, at the end of the day, why did you choose us? What were the business objectives you want to achieve, and did you receive that value? When it's buyers, You try to talk to them. You try to understand like how they look at an overall category, a market, their options, and how they choose what they're going to do within their business model. There's overlaps and similarities there. Obviously, you could talk to customers about the former, but I like to sort of separate the two because of where they are in their mind state, the state of mind when they're making a purchase.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good way to divide them. And on the customer side too, they just have more knowledge, obviously, from having been a customer where you can dig in deep, and maybe for your product research, that's more beneficial there. I found people are afraid to ask customers for feedback. It's something they run into a lot. So I've been at companies where more so, you started the call saying some people just don't do it. I've seen that because people are like, don't talk to our precious customer. They're going to stop buying our product if you talk to them, and it's kind of gate kept. So there's that, like, how do you get the company comfortable to realize, hey, this is actually a strategic priority that customers like, and it won't actually drive them away.
Yeah, I'm sure you run this problem all the time.
We do 100%.
Yeah, and that's common. It's across the board.
Yeah,
I've seen it since day one. And like I said, I've been doing this. When I started, Dustin, like I was working with fax machines and people were smoking in offices. And that's how long I've been doing this. So I've seen it since day one, and I think there's a ton of politics and reasons why that stuff is gatekept, to use your language. The ways in which we try to break this down, and I'm not alone in my thinking here, other people who do research, whether it's product marketers or, the UX researchers, product researchers. So you try to help them understand what a team is trying to accomplish. And then how do the insights that we gather help them increase the chances they're going to achieve that goal? So let's take sales, for example. Say their objective for a quarter or a fiscal year is they want to increase the number of qualified conversations by 3%. The modest goal. So my job as the marketer is to say, okay, let's talk about who we think our ideal client is. You tell me what your take is, I'll tell you mine. And once we get to a consensus, you can say, listen, I want to go find more of these people and give you the ability to have more of these conversations so you spend less of your time explaining and prospecting and more time closing. Let me talk to some of these people, help me get these people into a room, and I can understand how they came to us so I can influence that decision earlier on. That's really where you start to see the difference, is you start looking at the business outcomes and you start explaining how you're going to impact those. If you're trying to get your head of marketing on board, it's very simple. Like I want to build more effective programs. I want to ensure that we're not wasting our money, and that's a key one also for executives. If you talk to an executive or a founder, and you say, I want to ensure that we're de-risking the chance we waste the capital we're spending on all our programs, that lights up their eyes, especially finance people. So you sort of just have to understand what unlocks, the gate that is there in front of you and lifts it up. I'm not saying you're going to have perfect success doing these things, but you will definitely increase the chances, or you'll increase the likelihood that someone will be open to connecting you with a customer you can talk to.
Yeah, I like that point, because I think this probably happens with research, definitely happens with what we do, where they view customer stories as like a checkboxy thing they have to do. So they don't really know how to sell them. They don't know that outcome or benefit. They're just like, everyone does it, we should do it. And I think with research, there's some of that as well, where people will just say, people do surveys, let's do a survey, and don't really sell it, or it's not that they don't sell it. They don't even understand why they're doing it. It's like an autopilot thing sometimes.
Yeah, or that's what they've learned.
Yeah.
Because I've heard that term before, or, random acts of marketing is sometimes the term I've heard. And a lot of that is just learned over the course of time. But we don't ever question, why are we doing this thing? And are we actually getting value of it? Or should we do it differently? Because, again, surveys are wrong. It's more about how are you approaching them to get the value you need to make the decisions you need to make about the business.
Yeah, 100%. I think, so there's that front end part, like we just talked about, of getting people buy-in, actually doing the thing, figuring out the why. And then we touched on a little bit, there's the output side that people struggle with. So I'm curious, just from a more practical example point of view, you take people through these customer investigations all the time. What is the output at the end? What is the toolkit that you give them to actually now take this knowledge and do something with it?
Okay. I'm going to get super nerdy about qualitative research for a second, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So most of us are familiar with surveys, probably in some shape or form. With surveys, which is quantitative research, you're trying to get to a point they call statistical relevancy. We see those things like when margins of error are calculated, we want a certain number of respondents, maybe it's 200, 1,000, whatever. That's the sort of what we're trying to strive for. Qualitative research, which is not something a lot of people are familiar with, but we do in some capacity or another, there's a term called insight saturation. You can look it up. It's part of the academic world in qualitative research. So a few years ago, a lot of people have tried to, various academics tried to understand like what was the best sample size for qualitative research. I've read some of the peer-reviewed studies. It's very boring. I don't want any of you to read it, so I've done it for you. Once you start to hit 7 conversations, you're going to hit a term called insight saturation. What that means is you're starting to hear the same things over and over again, for lack of a better, to use lay terms to describe it. And if you plotted all your learnings on a bell curve, you're going to start tipping over around 12 to 15 interviews. So why in the world am I telling you all this? Well, the number of interviews you have is part of that successful outcome. I've heard time and time again, people say, we need to talk to 40, 50, 100 people. Possibly, there's reasons why you would. But for what I've seen, most people do not. What they need to do is actually keep their sample size tight and congruent and talk to a certain subset of customer buyer around certain specific parts around the business they want to understand. The second part, like how do you get to where you find success and good insights? So qualitative research is a few ways to sort of take the data, aggregate it, and make sense of it. The one I follow is a process called content analysis. There's more advanced ones, but again, I mentioned before, I like simplicity and like sort of pragmatic frameworks around this type of stuff. And all you're doing, Dustin, is you've set okay, these are the things I want to learn because these are the things that I want to impact in the business. And these are the topics of conversation I've had. I'm just taking insight 1, around how they found us or what was triggering their journey in to purchasing solution X. And I bucket all the answers into one category under that one topic. And then I just summarize it. And this is the through line of all the answers. It sounds so silly because when I show people this, they're like, what do you mean that's all you do? I'm like, yes, that's all I do, because that's the process of like how qualitative researchers do this stuff at a very basic level. And most B2B transactions follow a certain path of similarity. So you just have to find the themes and trends and patterns to aggregate this stuff. And then from there, all I do is assign action items to each thing. Say, okay, so this is one of those common buying triggers. We have no content or we have no marketing programs talking about this thing. So now I know where I'm going to invest my dollars over the next quarter when it comes to, say, content marketing or copy or event presentations or webinar presentations, what have you, right? Those things then inform what I'm going to do the next couple of quarters. Let me know if I didn't give you everything you needed there in that question, but that's like a really simple process to do all this stuff.
Yeah, that definitely answered it. And I think people like conflate the whole statistical significance thing and think it applies to qualitative data. I think that's where people get lost. They're like, oh, it's just a data point or two. But if it's a 45-minute conversation, it's a pretty significant data point.
It is. It is. And if I may, One of the reasons why, so I've been in sessions where I'm teaching this and I've had people push back on how many interviews I say they should conduct. And often it's product people. And that's fine because what they're trying to understand is often multi-user environments or validate an integration or a feature with multiple users. So they actually do have to go out and interview various segments of groups of 7 to 12. And that can turn into like 100 interviews. That's not what we're doing here as a marketer. I have an ideal buyer that I've probably identified through my sales team, the product team. There's certain firmographics and psychographics that fit around them. So I'm going to go and learn more about these people and what they were doing before they became high intent buyers. And that's why I only need a small group, a dozen maybe, to understand like what they're doing. Then I can do it again next year and see if anything has changed, right? Market forces, there's new trends in the industry where we haven't really fully understood, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've mentioned product people, sales people, marketing people. A lot of times this falls on either product or marketing, but I think, like you mentioned, you get all those questions, you aggregate, you answer all the questions. There's a lot of teams that have to be involved that you have to distribute this to actually make it effective. So I'm curious, when you run these programs at organizations, you're obviously working with marketing, probably working with sales, product. Who else gets brought in to these conversations?
I let clients decide that, but I think I am of the philosophy that B2B is a team sport. I don't think that one team owns the customer. One of the things I've seen lately on LinkedIn. You know, I both are on LinkedIn, I think quite a bit, is like the 4Ps sort of making a renaissance in some ways. And that's great. But some people say, well, marketing owns the 4Ps. Well, that's not correct. If you open the textbooks from the 60s where the 4Ps were initiated, it's a business analysis. Like it's the business owns the 4Ps, not marketing. Now, within a certain business model, marketing might drive most of that in a consumer model, but in B2B, it's distributed across the organization in many ways. So who's involved? Customer success probably involved. It's good for finance team to understand things about like how people are perceiving our pricing. You know, what are they comparing us to in the market for price? It's good for, the founding team to see like what's happening, trends in the market. I think everyone has to have some sense of like what's happening. It doesn't mean everyone has to do as deep a dive into what I want to know, but everyone should at least understand like what our buyers and customers are saying at every point of the journey that they have with us. Because like I said, it could be years that they're our partner. So we want to understand them deeply at all levels of the ways we interact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the pricing one is a perfect example to illustrate that, because that will be CEO, finance, operations, everyone trying to understand and make sense and actually implement that data. But I think, some of the key takeaways here are, one, actually do the work, do the research. But two, I think what you highlighted really strongly there is actually have a framework and plan ahead. And I think that's kind of my key takeaway on this one, at least, is think of the questions you want to answer before you actually just, do a bunch of surveys, have a bunch of conversations.
Yeah. And it's a balance. Don't keep it so simple that you're not actually doing it, have any rigor behind it, but you're also not mapping out like a nuclear reactor here, right? It's a balance of the two.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those topics. It's easy to get a little bit carried away, right? And go a little overboard. So if our listeners, if this resonated with them, they want to connect, want to do some customer investigations, want to learn more, where's the best place for them to connect with you, learn about Content Lift, all of that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best place to get me if you want to get me quick. Connect with me there. I post quite a bit. And then Content Lift is contentlift.io. I have some free resources on my site. Everyone's happy I'm happy to just take them. Like I don't gate them or anything. I just use them. Please go and do this work. It's not about me. It's about helping you. And really, if they just want to reach out and ask me a question, I answer every question I get. So I'm always just happy to try and help. That's like the key thing for me.
Awesome. So we'll include those links for our listeners. And Ryan, thanks so much for joining me on this one.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. My key takeaway is just not to conflate qualitative and quantitative research and get hung up on statistical significance. 7 in-depth, hour-long interviews likely gets you more insights than sending out 100 surveys and getting a few replies there. So plan ahead, think about the questions you want to answer, then conduct enough interviews until you get to that point of insight saturation like Ryan mentioned. So if you enjoyed this episode, hit follow on Spotify or leave us a 5-star review. I really appreciate all the support when you do that. And as always, I'll be back on Tuesday with a new episode.